live stream link. And make a recording too. So welcome folks as you guys come in. Make sure this is not making extra noise, but my name is Glenn Perkins and I'm the Community History Curator here at Greensboro History Museum. So excited to have you guys come to tune in for a little lunchtime learning with our friend Phil Koch, who's going to be sharing some reflections and some facts and great images about the end of World War II. You know, we're right between the anniversary of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. 75 years ago yesterday was the date that the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. And as we approach the end of the anniversary of the final end of World War II and the peace treaties that followed, we are reflecting on those moments and finding different ways, great ways to share some of those stories with our audience over online, since right now the museum can't be open to the public, but we're real happy to be able to deliver programs to you guys right on your home computers, which is a pretty nifty technology that seemed to have come along just at the right time. So I'm always happy to welcome Phil Koch, who I'll give you a quick introduction. Phil, for those of you who don't know him, Phil was born in New York City and he moved to Greensboro in 1975 with his wife Ann and 4 children. He retired from Siva Geigy's agricultural division in 1994. And in 2012, Phil returned to college and graduated with a degree in history in 2017 at age 82, which that made him the oldest ever to get his bachelor's at UNC Greensboro. And they were very excited to celebrate that, as were we all. So Phil has a special interest in 20th century history, as he likes to say, having experienced much of it personally. If any of you were able to come to his presentation on the Allied D-Day invasion, you know, he really gets thoroughly into the stuff of that end of the World War II history. So we're just thrilled to have Phil be able to share with us the end of the war in the Pacific. So Phil, are you all set?
All set, Glenn. Can you hear me?
Yes, I think we can hear you. So, oh, and a quick note before I turn things over, if anybody has questions for Phil, type them into the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will be keeping track of those and share those with him so we can have a little Q&A at the end when he's gotten through all his slides. So in the meantime, Phil, take it away. Look forward to hearing it.
Thanks, Glenn. Good afternoon, everybody, and we're going to talk about the end of World War II and the atomic bomb. Here's a couple of iconic photos to start us off with. The mushroom cloud that indicated the first use of the atomic weapon, and the celebration in New York and everywhere else in the world for the end of World War II. In the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, that was a battleship. The peace treaty was signed September 2nd, 1945, which will be 75 years ago next month. It was just yesterday that the 75th anniversary of the A-bomb was dropped. When World War II ended, it was the worst war in world history, with the millions of deaths, 25 million from the Soviet Union, 18 from China, etc., on down to where only the United States, France, and Britain only lost about less than 500,000 by comparison. But it was still devastating to us, but it was even worse to some of the other countries. The ENOLA Gay was a B-29 that dropped the first atomic bomb, and the first atomic bomb looked like this. It was called Big Boy. By the way, I'm going to go through a lot of these slides very quickly, because I want to really try to, in the interest of time, I want to recreate the attitude, if I can, of the civilians that lived in the United States and what their attitude was toward the end of the war. Now, there's arguments for using the atomic bomb and against using it that still prevail today. The arguments are for using it, our invasion of casualties were going to be very high, anywhere from up to 500,000 killed in the invasion of Japan. That's just Americans. Japan was weak and had no sign of surrender. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were strategic targets, or were they? Prevent more casualties on both sides. In the end, it would end the war. That was the arguments for using the atomic bomb. The arguments against was that Japan was already ready to quit if the Russian invasion, which was imminent, would have precipitated that. Why didn't we demonstrate a bomb first to show the devastating power of it? And we were trying to justify a $2 billion A-bomb development, and finally to show the Russians to enhance our position in the post-war World War II discussions and political scene. Now, all of these are good arguments, and I'll address the answers to them to the end, or at least my conclusions. Timeline in 1937 on was Japan invaded China, followed by Germany invading Poland, and World War started. Japan got into Indochina in September 1940, followed by a Japanese-Russian neutrality treaty, where they promised not to attack one another. Germany invaded Russia shortly after that, and in December, of course, Japan invaded the United States by bombing Pearl Harbor, Philippines, and I know you've seen a lot of that. So by January 1942, the Japan Empire had extended to where it included not only the dark blue of Japan and Korea, but it included also areas of Manchuria, Eastern China, and Southeast Asia, including Indonesia, and even as far as New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, which they occupied. But it sure triggered an emotional debate in the United States, or an emotional reaction, in that the Japanese were negotiating peace talks at the same time as they attacked Pearl Harbor. So there was a failure of communication on the part of the Japanese, but it resulted in a motivation for the United States to fight back by joining the services, or by getting into the defense units, even women and so on that hadn't worked before. Not that there wasn't women in the workforce. There's probably 30% of the women were working already, but a lot of women went to work in the United States during World War II. We went to rationing, meat shortages, ration books, ration stamps, lines, waiting for everything from meat, vegetables, and scarce items to gasoline. And it was gasoline limited, some as low as 3 gallons a week. I have to admit that I was alive during World War II, but I certainly wasn't in the service. I was about 7 years old when the war started, and about 10 years old when it ended. So I have recollections of the rationing stamps, the stickers that went on cars that allowed you so much gas. But even the women had to give up things, and like nylons and whatnot. Nylons had a very important wartime effort, not only parachutes, but a lot of other implements. The women had to even paint, were encouraged to paint, or they took upon themselves to paint little stripes on their legs to simulate wearing nylons. Meanwhile, the brutality of the Japanese was being shown on the newsreels and in the press. They were getting a lot of publicity out of the Japanese brutality that took place in China, where in the early stages, they killed almost everybody that, or as many people as they could, seemed like, in China when they invaded. By the end of the war, they'd killed 8 million people in Southeast Asia just in the areas that they occupied. And the brutality of the Bataan death march, as well as the prisoners of war camps that later came out, and it was starting to become apparent to the rest of the world how brutal the Japanese were. And I'll explain a little bit of that later. But 33% of the prisoners of war died in Japanese camps by the end of the war, and only 2% died in German camps. And a lot of that was from starvation, but a lot of it was just sheer brutality. The Japanese didn't have any respect for Japanese for any prisoners that gave up. They thought that death was better than surrender. That triggered a lot of racist propaganda in the United States, and racism that ended up looking like caricatures of and demonizing the Japanese. And what are you going to do about it? Getting everybody fired up, even to the point in California where most of the Japanese Americans lived. They were afraid that all of these Japanese Americans, 2/3 of whom were citizens, were going to be secret spies for the Japanese. Anybody with Japanese descent was suspect. So as a result, one of the darkest moments in American history resulted when they started moving people out of California and all over the West Coast, from Oregon and Washington on down to California. Sometimes they were given only a week to sell their homes, their businesses, and get out of town and get ready for this evacuation. They were essentially put into concentration camps. Not like concentration camps in Europe, but they were places that they lost a lot of money in the process, and a lot of them were, 2/3 of them, like I said, there was 62% of them at least was citizens. And it affected 120,000 Japanese Americans that were moved out of the West Coast into camps you see located on that map on the right, throughout the far west and as far east as the Mississippi. But the campaigns in the Pacific, remember, we were fighting a two campaign war, two front war, and a decision had been made early to go after the European campaign and go after the Germans first. That had highest priority amongst Stalin and Churchill and Hitler, and figured the Japanese would be easier at the end, or at least they had to set some priorities. So they went after Europe first. In the Pacific, it came down to a island hopping campaign that looked like this. There was a two-pronged approach by the Americans, mostly Army, and MacArthur came up on the west coast through New Guinea, Guadalcanal, and so on into Philippines. And the Navy Marines under Admiral Nimitz in charge came up through the other islands on the east side, Tarawa and Kwajalein, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Not to say that there wasn't Army helping the Marines and Marines helping the Army on both campaigns. And certainly Navy had to transport everybody into these island hopping campaigns. But the significant part was that they bypassed a lot of occupied islands that were occupied by Japanese soldiers. It was just easier to bypass some and just go after the ones that they really needed badly. The island hopping campaign consisted mostly of shelling the islands, landing on the shore, and supported all the way by aircraft carriers, which emerged in World War II as the significant naval ship strategic value that surpassed battleship navies that existed up to the World War II. The timeline in 1942 showed the United States, we interned in east side, the Japanese Americans in America. We bombed Tokyo through the Doolittle raid, and we had the Battle of Midway just 6 months or less than 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Guadalcanal was landed, Tarawa in 1943, Saipan in 1944. We're working our way up closer to Japan. And when Saipan dropped to the Americans, Tojo, one of the major warlords in Japan, was out. He was let go, so he lost his influence. And meanwhile, Leyte was in the Philippines, was landed by the Americans. Iwo Jima in 1945 got to be quite a bloodbath, but we were getting closer all the time. You can see it. By the time we got to Iwo Jima, we were only 700 miles from Japan, and we still had places to go further yet. But from Iwo Jima, we could start to get closer to bombing Japan, provide air support for the bombers, and then, just as important, provide places for emergency landings of the B-29s when they needed to come back. Most of them were coming out of the Marianas. Now, Iwo Jima in February 1945 was costly. It cost us 500 men killed and out of the 30,000 Marines that landed in just day one of Iwo Jima. And by the time we got finished, there was 6,800 killed, 19,000 wounded out of the 60,000 that ultimately landed in Iwo Jima. And then I had a first cousin that was wounded badly on Iwo Jima and took him out of the war after fighting in Saipan and other battle stars that he earned and a Purple Heart before that, but this one took him out of the war. So I had some personal interest in that. Iwo Jima provided this significant photo, which you're all familiar with. We've come to find out more and more that we're fighting people with this, exercising this code of Bushido, the samurai warrior thing, kamikaze, and so it ultimately resulted in kamikaze, which is kind of a suicide against the enemy, manifested itself in both kamikaze planes, which we'll talk more about, but as well as banzai charges and no surrender. We first saw these planes, kamikaze planes, in Leyte in October 1944, but they got worse in Iwo and Iwo Jima, and then later in Okinawa was really, it created a lot of problems. But you can see how desperate the Japanese were and how hard, to the death they were going to fight. There wasn't very much in the way of surrender. In the homeland defense, they were getting ready with their kamikaze samurai culture to provide 2,000 planes and pilots that were ready to fight off any invasions of Japan with torpedo boats. Military suicide bombers with landing craft would have run out at the landing craft with bombs strapped to their chest and blown themselves up. And even civilians were going to fight us on the shores with rudimentary weapons, pitchforks and pikes and things like that. So we knew it was going to be bad, but now there's some kamikaze pilots before they took off for their final flight. That's what we're facing. And here's an example of one of the ships that was hit bad. 2 kamikaze within 30 seconds hit the USS Bunker Hill. That took place in May of 1945 in Okinawa, and 352 men were killed. That's about another 300 men were wounded or missing. That's what happened from the Bunker Hill, which was a small aircraft carrier, one of the cheap carriers that occupied or that participated in the Okinawa invasion in May. Actually, Okinawa was in April, but they took this hit in May. All right, let's look at 1945. We're getting closer toward the end of Japan in the critical year. LeMay moves to Japan. General LeMay, head of the Strategic Air Command, and he changes from high-level to low-level fire bombs for Japan. We were missing a lot with the jet stream, which was kind of new to us, and we found out we weren't as accurate with the B-29s we'd hoped. He changed a lot to low-level fire bombs. In February, Iwo Jima was landed and took us about a month and a half to take care of Iwo Jima. At the Yalta conference in February, the USSR made a promise to invade Japan by that summer. They promised Roosevelt. It was Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin at Yalta. And in March, one of the Tokyo fire bombings, it was March 8th, 9th, or 9th and 10th, was about 80 to 100,000 people killed in Tokyo from the fire bombs, with all of the people in Japan that lived in houses that were made out of a lot of paper and wood and so on. The firebomb just roared through there from incendiary bombs that we dropped on them, and it killed more people in Tokyo that night than were ever killed in either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. was pretty terrible. Anyway, in April of 1945, we landed in Okinawa. Roosevelt died on April 12th. On April 25th, Truman, who was vice president, became president right after Roosevelt and didn't even know about the A-bomb until 2 weeks into his term of office as president. That's how secret the A-bomb thing was. Hitler dies the end of April, and in May 8th, the war in Europe ends with VE Day celebrated in Europe and Britain and so on. But the U.S. troops in the Pacific were being transferred to the Pacific for the big push finally end the Japanese war that was still going on in the Pacific. Not only U.S. troops, but the British, Canadians, and other allies. Meanwhile, in May, there was a U-boat that was on its way to Japan with nuclear materials from Germany, because Germany had been further advanced in nuclear development than the Japanese had been. And they were going to provide those materials to Japan when the war ended, and a little argument on board, but they finally decided to end the war by surrendering like they were advised to by the German High Command. In April 1945, Okinawa was attacked. By Okinawa, you can see we're even closer than we were in Iwo Jima. Okinawa is only 300 miles from the one of the islands in Japan, Kyushu. It was a bloody battle. The Okinawa is considered one of the major islands in the Japanese homeland, and it was a very critical thing for the Japanese to defend their homeland. It was getting tougher, and it also gave a pretty good indication of what they were going to face if they had to ultimately invade Japan, which they were already planning to do. In Okinawa, in the 82 days of Okinawa, we took 15,000 killed, 30,000 of which were Navy, and that mostly came from kamikaze planes, with another 38,000 wounded. Japanese casualties killed 85,000 just in Okinawa, plus another 100,000 civilians. But they're only 340 miles from Kyushu. Now, with those kinds of numbers of casualties by Americans and Japanese, you can imagine what would have happened if we had to go invade Japan. But they were making plans for Japan invasion, what they call Operation Downfall. It consisted of two parts. The Operation Olympic, which was going to hit the southern island in November 1945. That was only a couple months back, because we're now talking, what are we up to, May or June, right? So it's only less than maybe 6 months away, less than 6 months. We're going to hit the southern island. And the following March would be Honshu, and with invade Honshu with Operation Coronet. The estimates for just the first invasion we were going to send 400,000 ground troops, 7,000 planes against Japan, which we had estimated at the time to be 350,000 men and 2,500 planes against us from Japan. The fact of the matter is Japan was loading up Kyushu for the final big homeland defense. And they really had 650,000 we would have faced, and over 10,000 planes. So they were really loading up, and I'll explain more of some of that. So there we are with the two operations, part of Operation Downfall, which was Olympic and Coronet in November and March. The invasion fleet was getting ready in the harbor of Ulithi, which is one of the atolls in the Pacific Ocean. And that was just part of the invasion fleet. B-29s, meanwhile, was continuing to firebomb the Japanese city. And in a couple of months period, you had 67 cities bombed, and over 500 million killed. And this is I talked about the Tokyo firebombing with the March 10th firebomb photo. You can see what happens in a house full with a city full of wooden houses and get incendiary bombs. It took out almost everything. The aerial bombing of civilians we talk about is never very pretty to talk about, and I'm not justifying it by any means, but I want to explain what was going on up to this point. Remember, it started probably even earlier than World War I, but in World War I, remember, we had dirigibles flying over London, dropping bombs. In the pre-World War II, Manchuria and the Spanish Civil War found more use of bombing of civilians in cities. And of course, Germany was bombing Britain with the Blitz that started in September 1940. And Britain and the US were bombing Germany by the time the US get in there on a pretty regular basis. So there was a lot going on in Europe. There was a theory going on at the time that the morale would collapse, morale of civilians and soldiers. And of course, that proved to be not very correct, but that's what everybody thought at the time. And there was also, you'd say, well, who are combatants? Do they include production workers? Do they include the homes that they live in and the suppliers that are nearby the defense plants? We didn't have smart bombs in those days, so you couldn't hardly hit defense plants without surrounding areas. And a lot of the workers and homes nearby would suffer, and the suppliers, and especially cottage industries that might supply defense plants nearby. And of course, the Japanese or any of the other enemies would know if you're going to spare some of these civilian towns as civilian areas of a city, that's where they'd want to increase their defense parts to where defense plants to where it would be a little bit more protected. And there's another thing to think about. We were already firebombing Japan, and we were 500,000 killed. Again, that's a terrible number, and I'm not trying to justify it. I'm just explaining what had happened, why civilians were included in all of that. June of 1945, we had increased strikes in Japan, blockade tightened. Hirohito was quoted as saying, "Here, we will fight to the bitter end." So there was no indication that Japan was going to surrender by any means. But Truman okayed the Japan invasion plans such as they were. Okinawa ended, airfields were operational. That would mean we could bomb even more, bring our Navy in closer. And Japanese troops withdrew from China for their homeland defense. Japan was still operating on secret weapons a lot of people didn't know about. But one of them was a 400-foot submarine called the U-400. It's a pretty good picture or artist's graphic illustration of it. It was a submarine, the largest submarine in the world, 400 feet, that included 3 planes with foldable wings that stayed down inside until they were ready to be launched. Then they were brought up on the surface and launched on this pad here. You can see on the front of the almost toward the bow of the ship. Now there was one 400-foot submarine with their crew of 144 in 1945 headed for the Panama Canal with the idea of bombing the Panama Canal, putting it out of action, and keeping us from having to be able to transport ships and so on through the canal. The 3 submarines were called back when the United States invaded Okinawa, and they were also planned to be used in a later period, but that's as much as they ever got. But they did have those 3 operational submarines and maybe more. I'm not sure about that part of it. In July of 1945, the Philippines were secure, and there was carrier planes attacking Tokyo. Japan was already inquiring of Russia, their ally, sort of. Well, it was still operating under a peace treaty, whether they could get into some peace negotiations with America or whatever. But they had some pretty strict demands that the allies wouldn't adhere to. And July 16th, the A-bomb test finally took place in the United States. The first A-bomb ever exploded in New Mexico, went off okay. Truman found out about it while he was at the Potsdam Conference with Stalin and Churchill and Clement Attlee, who became the British Prime Minister. During the end of the conference, after Churchill found out he wasn't reelected, or his party wasn't reelected. In any event, on the 26th of July, the declaration for the Potsdam Conference called for unconditional surrender, no conditions. And Japan reacted with silent disdain. It was the ultimate insult to the surrender demand. In fact, war was still going on, and our own heavy cruiser, the Indianapolis, was sunk by a Japanese sub in July 30th, and with 883 killed. Japan was getting ready for a homeland defense like nothing we've ever seen. They had 2,000 planes, torpedo boats, personal bombers, and so on, arms, spikes, home weapons, etc., with civilians. The military had 650,000 troops in Kyushu, where we were going to invade. And the secret weapons under development included the A-bomb. Japan had their own A-bomb development program, which a lot of people didn't know about. And but the earliest that they could have gotten anything going was probably the end of the year, at the very earliest if everything fell right. It didn't, of course. But jet fighters, Japan was working on some, especially when they got hold of some plans that the Germans supplied for their Me-262 jet plane, which was the first jet fighter that was introduced in Europe toward the end of the war. Too late to do the Germans any good, but the Japanese were working on it. So they're working on jets, rocket development in the mountain area production, and working in caves where we couldn't get at them with bombs. Actually, was a kind of a plan in action where the German A-bomb or German atomic bomb weapon would be supplied for a Japanese 400-foot submarine with a kamikaze plane to fly to California. And that was going to take place in August of 1945. Of course, that never developed, never happened, and I'm not saying it would have, but those was kind of the things that were in the works and at least some under development. Oops. We had intelligence going on at the time, which was wonderful. We had broken the Japanese naval code early on in the year, early on in the war, in Jan 25, even before the war. We knew where their convoys and ships were going and helped make our U.S. subs in the Pacific extremely effective, helped with the blockade of Japan. But the purple code, which they used for diplomats, we were reading as Germany and Japan communicated back and forth their military plans during the war. We were reading a lot of that from the code breaking. But the more important, even towards this period, was the fact that the Russian ambassador and Japan ambassador from Russia was communicating, and we were reading those plans, and we knew what was going on behind the scenes in Tokyo, is how serious they were about peace, what kind of demands they were making, and where the power struggle was. And it was a power struggle. Diplomats had plans, authority, and then the war negotiations. We knew what they were saying, so there was nothing public that we didn't know about. Potsdam ended on the first in the early part of August with no Japan response. The first A-bomb was dropped in Hiroshima on the 6th of August. On the 7th and 8th, Japan continued internal debates. On the 8th of August, Russia invaded Japan. They told Japan they were going to stop the treaty, and they invaded Manchuria. Nagasaki A-bomb was dropped shortly thereafter, a couple of hours later, just so coincidental. But Russia wanted to get into the war before it was over so that they could get a piece of the action. And Kokura was the primary target, but when it got clouded over and whatnot, and they couldn't get a good sighting on it, they hit on Nagasaki. But the Japan continued debating August of 10th to 13th. And finally, the emperor stepped in and said he will broadcast a peace plea to all of his people on the 14th of August. And that night, there was still a segment of the Japanese military and government that wanted to keep on fighting to the very end, save their honor, because Japan had never been invaded. They formed a palace coup, and it was significant. I mean, it was fighting, and in fact, the general in charge of the palace guard to protect the emperor did not side with the other side, and he was killed. On the 15th, then the emperor got on the radio for the first time in history. The Japanese people heard their emperor speak, and he said, "The war's over, stop fighting." And a week later, on the 22nd, Russia finally stopped fighting. We declared VJ Day, and a celebration started on the 15th to the 16th of August. But Russia stopped fighting a week later after they bit off as much territory as they thought they could get away with. Here's pictures of Hiroshima right after the bombing, and I think dead center target was somewhere back at that bridge in the back left. But that's what the A-bomb did. We were closing in when Japan, on Japan from the southeast, well, Russia hit Manchuria on their August 9th invasion. The boxcar is the B-29 that hit Nagasaki, and that presides right now. It sits at the Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. That's the bomb they used that was a fat man called a plutonium bomb. Now, the first bomb that we used was an A-bomb, was a uranium bomb, but they had found it easier to make or quicker to make with the, sorry about that, with the fat man plutonium bomb. The fact is, we only had one more almost ready. We didn't have very many more after that. In our stockpile, we wanted the Japanese to think we had an unlimited supply of A-bombs, but we didn't. In fact, there was still some demonstrating or still some research going on about it. So it was still an experimental thing. But thank goodness the first few worked anyway, stopped the war. Nagasaki was hit pretty bad. A little different from Hiroshima. They've got a little bit more hills, so it was a little bit more contained in the blast, but there was still significant, about 40, 50, 60,000 people killed, which was not good. But there's the emperor. The emperor got to stay. MacArthur was going to preside in post-war Japan, and that was one of the biggest arguments in the peace negotiations, because that was the last thing that the Americans had to concede, that the emperor would stay. If he hadn't, then there would have been problems. There he is, MacArthur and Hirohito presiding over Japan at the end. The ceremony took place in Missouri on September 2nd with dignitaries, military, and so on from Japan. A lot of military brass from the United States signing the documents. And VJ Day was proclaimed all over the world and all over the United States especially. And that was the end, or was it? There was still a lot of debate about the A-bomb. Let me go quickly through some of these arguments that we introduced at the beginning. Japan was ready to quit, but who knew? They were not communicating. Would the Russian invasion have prompted Japan to quit? Oh, absolutely. In fact, that was probably a factor. So that was definitely yes. Would we have demonstrated a bomb first? No, that was very impractical. If we had dropped a bomb in Tokyo Bay to demonstrate how effective it is, and we don't know how for sure that the Japanese would have even paid that much of attention to, or would have triggered the surrender response. And if it had been a dud, which would have been the results would have even been worse. Could we have was a good reason to use it against using it was that we were trying to justify a $2 billion development. I don't think that was a factor, but we wanted to show the Russians for post-war political purposes. Yeah, that was a definite yes. So the ones I've got yes on, I think were good arguments against, but the arguments for were very high. The invasion casualties, Japan casualties for the invasion was high. Yes, I think that was, I don't think that we would have hit lost 100 or 500, but there's no way of telling. 500,000 with the initial invasion. Japan was weak, but no sign of surrender. There was definitely yes. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were strategic targets. No, that's not a good argument because they're one of the few. They weren't any more strategic than any place else. Prevented more casualties on both sides, absolutely. In the war, blockade U.S., yes, but when? In other words, if the USS Russia had invaded Japan and we continued the blockade, would we have finally squeezed the Japanese into the end of the war? Absolutely. But when? Would it have gone on for a couple more months? Finally, to me, the argument that's strongest of all is if Truman had said, no, we're not going to use the weapon to end the war, public history and history would demand to know why. Why he didn't use it. If people got killed in September, October, November while we're waiting for the Japanese to surrender, who could have answered the question, why didn't we use the bomb? And with that, I'll conclude my comments at this point, and thank you very much for listening. Glenn, back to you.
Great, thank you. Thanks so much, Phil. I think you've really given us a lot to think about. If anybody does have questions they want me to convey over to him, just go to that Q&A box at the bottom and type it in. I think it's, I don't know if you've gotten a chance, Phil, to go to Hiroshima and see the Peace Park there, but it's actually a really impressive site that they've got with a monument at the where the bomb was dropped. And when I went there, I was lucky to have a chance to see to hear from one of the hibakusha, the survivors of the bomb, who he told the story of having been in school when the bomb was dropped. And it was just such a remarkable story to have been there, to have heard that firsthand account from somebody on the, about that moment in history that we all remember. I was curious. You were growing up. You were in New York City, right? 9 years
Right.
old on VJ Day. Do you remember? Have specific memories of what the mood or the things were like after the bomb was dropped and as we moved to VJ Day?
Well, the fact of the matter is I was in New England on a farm spending the summer. So I wasn't in New York City. My wife did. In fact, she's got wonderful memories of coming into this city, or she lived in New York, but she was out in Long Island spending the summer with her mother, and she came in and celebrated all over Broadway that night. And they had a wonderful time, but it was quite a celebration. But I do remember a lot of the things about World War II. But unfortunately, I remembered more of a VE Day than the VJ Day, frankly. But go ahead.
I think it's, yeah, I mean, I think people were, had that one moment back in May, and then, the war stretches on. I think when you point out that thing about the Indianapolis being bombed, right at the end of July, it's kind of shocking to think about, nearly 900 sailors in the submarine, right, losing their lives right so close to the end of the war. So we've got compliments for you from Harry Thetford. Says, great job, Phil, and thanks for your well-developed details.
Thank you.
And some other compliments on the presentation. What did you find sort of were really good sources of information for you as you were kind of putting this together? Where were some of the best books? Or
Well, I've got a bunch of books, including probably the heaviest arguments against the use of the A-bomb was by a guy named Alperovitch, which I read and I cited. And in my bibliography, I also quote a couple of other books that I've read that were more pro, or at least try to be more objective about the use of the bomb. I've also read a lot of magazines, documentaries on TV, and magazine articles about the war. And of course, there's a lot on television and a lot on a computer, if you know how to do a little bit of research, which I learned in college not too long ago. So that helped a lot. But I've got a whole bibliography page that that I can show you or share with you if I need it.
Let's see. So Jerry Andrews was talking about some of the war atrocities of Japan, like Bataan and the rape of Nanjing, and was asking sort of how those, I guess, do you read about those in some of the sources as you're researching as sort of moral equivalence or questions to sort of compare what happened with the bomb versus, the ongoing, some of those atrocities that the Japanese army had perpetrated. I know, between Korea and China, there are a lot of.
Well, it's pretty hard to justify, the use of the A-bomb just on that. But there was an attitude prevail that we're going to have to kill these Japanese to beat them. I mean, there was no question about that part of it, the attitude. In fact, one of the things that I looked up was a lot of the public opinion at the end of the war was very much in favor of using the bomb, stopping the war. And most important thing was ending the war so people would stop getting killed.
Mm-hmm.
I remember reading a statistic one time that said that something like 10,000 Chinese a month were being killed under the Japanese occupation. As just one example of one of their occupation areas. And that might have continued, but and the reason that I give you the whole thing about the racism that existed in the United States and was perpetuated by the United States and the propaganda efforts was to recreate, if I could, the attitude. It was something like 70 or 80% of the people really wanted that war to end, and always thought even a month later that we really did the right thing. Because the Japanese didn't agree,
Mm-hmm.
understandably, and you'd feel bad about thinking about the Japanese, who are really nice people and good people, but they really, like a lot of areas, they got snookered by some of their leaders who kind of co-opted the Bushido and samurai thing for their own efforts and turned them into suicide people, as warriors. So, but we knew about a lot of that through publicity, and that's one of the things that drove us to do what we needed to.
Yeah, I think it's, all the civilian stories of the war are really hard to take. There's so many horrible ones, in particular from the Second World War. I'm glad, that you pointed out the, sort of mentioned the Japanese internment camp question in the United States. That's something we've been thinking about. We were lucky, I guess, when we recently here at the museum had as our second generation Asian American exhibition. Someone had kept their card that they had, the sort of to go, their sort of registration card of their parents or grandparents at a Japanese internment camp, and just the way that object got handed down within the family, and that story got handed down within the family. It's interesting to me, sort of the way these, our memories of these moments in the past come down to us through the different times. Let's see. We don't have any other real questions from our audience right now. Are you working on any other projects or research right now?
No.
No.
No, I think we're kind of finished with the celebration of the war. I'm not sure I'll be around for the 100th anniversary of D-Day or the drop or the end of World War II. But in any event, no, I'm not working on any of those. I've got some others in the hopper that still remain from college. Some of the college stuff I worked on a couple of years ago, but that's about it.
Well, I think you're such a great example of showing how you can take this fascination that you maybe cultivated a long time of history, and that desire to learn it, you know, to have gone back to college and then to sort of take what you learned in college and sort of be able to share that with people, I think is really a great, is a great gift that you're giving to the community. So I hope that folks watching will be able to, you know, get in touch if you have a civic group or a book club or something that you want Phil to, you know, answer some questions or support. I'm sure he'd be happy to get in touch.
Glad to do it. Be glad to share any of the slides or any of the materials that I have. Anybody wants to borrow a book, have a slide, I'll be glad to send it.
Well, that's great. We really appreciate you having spent a little time with us. We've got a lot more online programs coming up at the museum all through this month of August. We've got some things devoted to questions about racism and history, a webinar for educators about teaching difficult history to students, and some celebrations at the end of the month or commemorations looking at the 100th anniversary of women's right to vote, the suffrage movement, and the 19th Amendment. So go to our website, greensborohistory.org, click on the events page, send your friends over there. There's a lot of great stuff coming up. So, and we'll be beaming it all to you on your computers over the next few weeks. We're looking forward to reopening the doors to the museum doors to the public at some time, get the building back opening. But in the meantime, you know, we're really trying to use the technology we can to share Greensboro history to as many people as we can. So tell your friends, and we'll look forward to seeing some of you at the next program. Thank you again, Phil, for spending some time with us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Glenn.
All right, well, we'll say goodbye and look forward to seeing you guys next time. Thanks a lot. Bye, Phil. I appreciate all the. We'll see you again soon, okay?
Okay, thanks.